Commercial Real Estate 101 for residential agents. If you're looking to expand the suite of services you offer your clientele and some additional income streams, this is the webinar for you. Now, be aware, many residential firms do not allow their agents to engage in commercial real estate. So be sure to check with your principal broker and legal representatives for your company's policies and procedures. All right, let's get into it. We're going to look today at the differences between commercial and residential. We're going to look at some valuation techniques and one very important one. And then we're just going to go through a real typical purchase and sale process. And through that, we'll be able to talk about different paperwork and different things that we're going to see in the commercial world. So let's start with, what is commercial real estate? Well, to define that, let's start with what's residential real estate. This is a common definition, and we also find this in the Hawaii Revised Statutes. It's 1 to 4 units used for dwelling, right? Occupancy as a residence. An example here, if it were a small apartment building of 1 to 4 units, under the statute, that is still defined as a residential property. If it's something 5 units or more, that would certainly be under the commercial definition. So when we look at commercial property, it's generally something being purchased and owned for business or income generating purposes, and it's something that doesn't fall under the definition of residential. And these are some of the common asset classes that we see, right? And you're probably familiar with most of these. Multifamily, those are apartment buildings, and now you know 5 units or more, right, becomes commercial. Office space. So Class A is like our beautiful office in downtown, right? We're in a Class A building, and then B is a lower level, and then C are some of the lowest levels in the office class. Retail, that encompasses a lot of different things. So that can be stores, it can be restaurants, services, etc. Hospitality and resort, these are hotels, timeshares, things that are built around the resort, master plan communities. Quite often, this is something that we receive inquiries about, right? About buying hotels here in Honolulu. Industrial, very important part of the market and one of the hottest right now in Hawaii. Land can also be classified as commercial. And then special use, and then this list can go on and on, but there are people who really specialize in these various areas, healthcare, education, etc. So let's start to look at some of the differences between residential and commercial, again, through the eyes of residential agents, looking through our eyes as a residential agent. So one of the big ones that's always surprising for most people is there is no central place that you can go and find properties. There is no MLS that has all the properties for sale, which is kind of what we're used to, right, in residential. When we get to commercial, there are some third-party sites like LoopNet and some others. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is one of the real big ones, is not having that central site where all the properties can be found. In residential, we're most used to on-market properties, not all the time, but most of the time, it's something that's for sale. It's someone knows about it, they're advertising it. When we get to commercial, there's quite a lot of off-market properties that are transacting and being sold. And if you think of some of the biggest transactions that have taken place in Hawaii over the last 5 or 10 years, the majority of those probably are off-market deals. Some of the large master plan communities, some of the hotel sites, et cetera, off market, and there's, of course, some on market. Residential, we have the Board of Realtors rules and ethics. Commercial has no equivalent. And if you, no dig on the commercial guys, but there is no equivalent and there is no process if you have a complaint against someone unless they are a member of the Board of Realtors. But it is a big difference. This is a real big one. Standard forms and contracts on the residential side. We're all used to what we have, right? We have zip forms, we have our toolbox. When we get into the commercial world, it's limited use of standard forms. There are some that are used. We'll talk about the PSA in a moment. Quite often on a lot of the transactions, it's a unique form that is developed every time. And then finally, on the residential side, we have sort of a standard offer and acceptance procedure, right? We know we submit a contract, there's counters on standard paperwork, we understand the process. It's varied in commercial, and it can be very, very different depending on the seller and the structure that they're employing. We are most used to exclusive listings and exclusive buyer rep contracts. right? In the residential side, mostly. On the commercial side, we will see a lot of non-exclusive agreements. Um, there was a group out of California that we represented looking for hotel properties. They do not want to be exclusive to a broker, so we were one of many, but then that allows us to introduce properties to them. Right now, Yoshi and I just signed a non-exclusive for a big master plan development site. And same thing, they just want whoever can go out there and bring them a buyer, bring them a seller, they're going to work with them. Financing, very different. In the residential side, it's pretty standardized in some ways, right? They're specialty product, but the majority of deals are pretty standardized. Commercial side, very different. And then also on the commercial side, the property itself must qualify at a higher level, even more so than what we see on the residential side. And the regulatory environment is very different. And one of the real big ones, when we're talking about residential, we have the seller disclosure statute, right? We're pretty familiar. We understand the seller needs to disclose all these things. There is no equivalent in the commercial world. It doesn't mean the sellers don't have to disclose some things, but for the most part, there is no standardized disclosure rules and regulations. Then also fair housing. We have fair housing in residential. We're not going to have that in commercial, except in some cases like in apartment buildings, et cetera. But on a commercial side, we're going to deal with things like the EPA, the Superfund, doing phase one environmentals, EIS, environmental impact statements, and it kind of goes on and on. But that's another component of this. If we talk about leasing dynamics, in residential, we're used to a 1 year, maybe a 6 year lease term. That's what we're looking at. On the commercial side, generally lease terms are going to be 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, or plus. And there might be options attached to that and all sorts of things like that. Residential escrow requirements are in some ways similar, but in many ways different when we get to the commercial side in the escrow requirements and documentation that's needed. We're not going to talk too much about that today, but it's just something to be aware of. And then finally, on the valuation of properties, for the most part, we are using comparative market analysis, right? When we go to price a home, price a condo, et cetera. When we get into the commercial world, there's a multitude of valuation techniques. Some of the projects I was involved in, those pro formas are 30, 40 pages for the main body with all sorts of attachments that throw data in there, can get extremely complicated. But we're going to look at one valuation method particular today. And here's a list of some of the things that you will hear for the commercial side. The discounted cash flow used quite often, gross rent multiplier. You can see the other ones here, but there's one that you hear every day, and it's you need to understand this one. This is the basics, right? Commercial real estate 101 is the cap rate, capitalization rate. You see this all the time. You receive emails right now. Someone has X property for sale and they're selling it with a 4% cap rate or a 5% cap rate. It can be confusing, but hopefully my example today is going to make it nice and clear. So let's do this. Let's say I have $1 million cash and I take my $1 million and I go to the bank and I say, bank, what's the interest rate you'll pay me if I leave this with you for 1 year? And in this case, they're telling me 3%. So my annual income would be 30,000 for the year, right? $1 million in my savings account, 3% interest. End of the year, I'm going to get $30,000. I'm going to get a check. Now, this is before taxes. This is before compounding interest. Let's not think about any of that stuff. Just a real straight, here's my investment, here's the rate, here's my annual income. Now, let's shift that over to a commercial purchase. I have my $1 million and I go and I buy this property for $1 million. Turns out it has a 3% cap rate. That means at the end of the year, I'm going to end up with a check of $30,000. And that's called the net operating income. And that's just simply the income minus the expenses. This is the number I'm going to get. So if I put it in the bank, I'll get 30,000. If I put it over here in the commercial property, I'm going to get 30,000 net operating income. And you'll see I made a little note at the bottom here, which is another term that you'll hear in commercial. EBITDA, people pronounce it differently. This is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, because all those things are going to have an effect on the net that I get. Same thing with my savings account, right? I'm going to have to pay taxes, et cetera. So the cap rate is a simplified way of doing this just to get right to the bottom line. What is this particular investment going to throw off as far as a capitalization rate? So a way to think of it is the cap rate is just like the interest rate in a bank. Okay, so we can see 3%. Now, the beauty is if we have two of these things known, we can calculate for the other. What do I mean by that? So if I bought something for $1 million and it's going to generate 30,000 in NOI, what's the cap rate? Right. And you can easily calculate that and say, well, that's a 3% cap rate. Okay, well, what if it's a property at a 3% cap rate and the NOI is 30,000? What should I buy it for? So I want to get at least a 3% cap rate or return on my investment. It's throwing off 30,000 in net operating income. So what's the purchase price? Of course, it's $1 million, right? You can see how the math goes. I have $1 million. I want a 3% cap rate. What property am I going to look at? What am I consider? How much NOI does it have to be throwing off? And that, of course, is 30,000. So you can see how you can use these formulas all these different ways. You can calculate for cap rate, you can calculate for net operating income, you can calculate for purchase price. These are the fundamentals of using the cap rate when you're evaluating properties. Okay, so I think you've got a clear understanding of that. Hopefully that makes it clear and you're able to kind of go up and down and through this thing with the cap rates. So when we talk about cap rates, what changes a cap rate? Well, if it's a higher risk investment, I would want a higher cap rate, right? If it's a lower risk investment, I don't mind taking a lower cap rate. Think about investing in some financial product. If I go into the bank, I might be happy with my 3%. I know my money's totally safe. Nothing can happen to it. Or maybe I want to get a higher return. So I say, put it all in crypto, let it ride, right? Then if I do that, I want to see a higher return. And in the purchasing of property, that's going to be a higher cap rate. For example, in today's world right now in Honolulu, if you found a really nice concrete apartment building that's been decently maintained and it's in a good area, you probably could sell that on a 3 or 4% cap rate. Well, let's shift that over to something on Ke'eaumoku, an old building. It's made out of wood and it's got 6 retail tenants that are barely hanging on. You're going to want more than 3% because that's high risk, right? So you might want to look for something around a 10% or an 8 or a 7 or whatever that number might be. So there you go. Higher the risk, the higher the cap rate. Lower the risk, lower the cap rate. Hi, this is Patrick. If you're enjoying this information, please do give us a thumbs up down below and be sure to subscribe. So I mentioned earlier, there's no central source to find a property. So let's say you have a buyer tomorrow or a tenant that's looking for property. Where do you go and find things? Well, we can start in our MLS because there are some listings there. So if you haven't gone there, you go here and instead of searching residential, just drop down and get to the commercial and see what you can see. There's also a really, really, really good tool as part of your MLS, part of HBR, which is the RPR. And I don't know if you're using this, but it is a great tool for residential and commercial. But today we're talking about commercial. Go to RPR and you can see this tab over here. I've got it circled. You just click it, tab it down to commercial. You can go commercial, residential, take it to commercial, put in the criteria. It's amazing what they have in there. The data is incredible. So this is a great place to look as well. And this will pull from all sorts of different sources. But check this out, RPR. The other big one is LoopNet. This is the go-to for anybody in commercial real estate. It won't have every property, but it will have a lot. And if you have a listing, you definitely want to put it into LoopNet as well. And they offer all sorts of things if you want to advertise it and promote it. You can sign up for LoopNet for free. You won't have access to everything, but you'll have a good idea of what's out there. And you'll be able to find some properties through LoopNet. The other one is go to some of the commercial brokerage firm websites. You go there, they're going to have everything they have for sale, everything that they have for lease. Yeah, it's hard work because there's no central MLS, but this is another tool, another place you can go to and go check it out. Now, the other one, which is pretty common, is just go to the area and look for signs. I think Kanai had somebody recently who was looking for something in Kaka'ako. They wanted to do a coffee cafe shop or bubble tea or something. And then Kanai just went down there and drove around and found some places with signs on it, and that became the starting point for that. So it's another thing to do. Just go down there and look for signs. You'll see them for lease or for sale. And the other, if you really start to get into this, is networking. Networking with brokers, networking with other professionals. I mentioned Kanai earlier. Kanai is a great example. Kanai came in. She is a fantastic residential agent, had never done a commercial transaction. She had a lead, came to me. We shepherded the thing through. She did her first deal. She did her second deal. I think at this point, Kanaya has probably done 2 dozen or more commercial transactions, and she's now getting referrals, including from some of the attorneys that she has worked with. But this is a really important part of this. For my world, my connections are mainly in the hotel industry. So I've got a good network of brokers and owners, and then also in the development side. So anyway, I just point that out. That's another great spot, which is networking with our community. Okay, and now off-market properties. So I'm often asked this, are there any hotel properties for sale? And I say, look at Waikiki. Every hotel down there is not for sale. Every hotel down there is for sale. Many of the big transactions are going to be off market. There was a client that we had recently. They had very specific criteria of what they wanted in a hotel property. We met with the GMs who said, property's not for sale. I'd be happy to submit the paperwork for you. And we're just going direct. We're just contacting owners direct to see if you get a bite. Very common. Nothing's for sale, everything's for sale. That is definitely a motto in the commercial world. So these are the spots that you can go and you can find properties for your clientele, whether it's a buyer or a seller. Okay, regulatory issues. I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to impress upon you this. There is no seller disclosure statute in commercial real estate. And you'll remember this word from your real estate school is the last time you used it, caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware, which used to be the whole real estate market. But really, this is true in the commercial real estate world. Sellers can't commit fraud. There are some things that they would definitely want to disclose, but for the most part, it's up to the buyer to discover the property, and the seller is under no statutory obligation to make those disclosures. Some other regulatory issues that are different, of course, fair housing, which is something that we regularly think about in our industry in residential. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, is really important for commercial side, especially if it's something that's going to be a retail environment or public-facing businesses. And the environmental regulations. If you look at the standard purchase and sale contract, the PSA for commercial, there is a paragraph in there where you can check phase 1 environmental to be done. And a phase 1 just does a quick assessment to see if there might be potential issues that would fall under the EPA. And then zoning and land use complexity. It can get very complex in the commercial world as we look at those items. Okay, commercial forms and contracts. So let's take a walk through this, and we're going to start with exclusive and non-exclusive listings and buyer rep. So I mentioned earlier, it's very, very common to have non-exclusive buyer and listing reps in the commercial world. And this would also apply to leasing, whether you're leasing for a tenant on behalf of the tenant or on behalf of the landlord. So we're used to the exclusive right to sell listing contract, which can still be used and is used in many cases. Sharon, if you don't mind me sharing, has a big apartment building, which she listed using the exclusive right to sell listing contract. It's in escrow. Congratulations. But oftentimes we'll use the not exclusive, which will also allow us to introduce buyers to sellers. And we in advance have agreed upon agency and the fee structures. Exclusive and non-exclusive buyer representation contracts. So on the left, we see our typical buyer rep contract, which you absolutely can use for commercial. That is allowed. On the right, we see the buyer agency and representation agreement, which is non-exclusive. And this is used quite often, especially for larger companies that are feel like they'll get better service if they're out there just dealing with all multitude of brokers. Now, I don't know if that's 100% true or not, but that's their view. Now, other forms that you will hear or the agents will ask you to sign, oftentimes before we will release any information on a commercial property, we're going to ask to have the buyer or tenant sign a confidentiality agreement or a CA or a non-disclosure agreement or an NDA. This is just to ensure that the information that's released remains private, and takes it from there. And then this is a very important form, which is the non-binding letter of intent, known as the LOI. This is how many commercial transactions begin, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail as we look at the process. But this just lays out the basic terms of the purchase contract or the leasing agreement, and then after that, a formalized document is prepared by an attorney. So non-binding letter of intent, let's just talk about this for a moment and think about it in terms of a purchase. So on the LOI, we're going to have price and terms, the due diligence period. That means the inspection period where the buyer can cancel for any reason. Think of that as our J1 period in residential. On the PSA, it's actually the J2 period, just to make things confusing. But the due diligence period, the closing date, and now an important component to this is once the parties have agreed, so we're using this basically to negotiate some high-level deal points. Once we've agreed on the basics, now there's going to be a time frame to enter into a binding agreement. So the LOI might go back and forth for a week. Suddenly everybody agrees on the big deal points. Now we're going to go and move into a binding agreement, generally prepared by an attorney. The LOI will also state who's going to pay for that initial drafting of the agreement. Generally, it's the landlords or the sellers, but it's negotiable. And in the LOI, we are also going to lay out agency and commissions, who's paying who and who represents who. And then finally, the commercial purchase and sale agreement, which is known as the PSA. This is a standard form in ZIP forms. And right now, many of you might know, I'm heading the committee to revise this. I've got a meeting tomorrow. So this whole thing is being revised, but it is something that's used. And I was surprised how much it is used, but it's used quite a bit from the commercial guys. And then, of course, in the residential side, it's for more simple transactions. But for more complicated ones, we are always having attorneys draft those agreements. Okay, so this will kind of wrap up on this. Going to look at in a general sense, a commercial transaction, kind of what happens in this. So let's say in this case, we're working with a buyer or a seller. Just like anything else, we're going to start off with a signed listing or a signed buyer's rep contract. One thing I can tell you, do not offer any information to a buyer or seller about anyone you know before you get this signed. Commercial world is notorious. A buyer will say, well, tell me what the properties are. And then maybe I'll sign the contract. No. You got to get this thing signed first. So that's where it all begins. After we find the property, then we're going to submit the non-binding letter of intent. We just talked about that, and that's going to lay out the basic terms. And this is where the majority of negotiation is going to take place at this stage. So we're going back and forth on the LOI just to get the large deal points down. Once we come to agreement, now someone prepares the PSA. And as I mentioned earlier, generally it's the seller, and they're going to pay for that initial one. Then the other party has their attorney who's going to review that initial draft, and further negotiation is going to take place. A lot of that'll be technical. Some of it will still be deal point. And then this is where maybe they're trying to squeeze out your commission. So you got to be involved in this one as the further negotiations go forward. And then finally, a binding PSA will be signed by all the parties. Now, at that point, it's a binding deal. Up until that point, it's nothing other than just two people talking. But this is a typical transaction. You'll see it in leases, you'll see it in purchases. Now, in some cases, using the PSA from the beginning, then you just avoid all this and you bypass it. So if it's a simple transaction, the commercial PSA, which is in zip forms, is fine. But for the more complicated transactions and generally for leases, this is how everything starts off. Okay, and I'm going to just make a plug for the CCIM. This is the trade organization associated with the National Association of Realtors for commercial brokers, and it is phenomenal. Classes are amazing. If you have any interest, take this CI 101. It'll blow your mind as far as how the financial analysis, how deep it can go, and all the different ways that you can look at a property. And that's only the 101. The 104 is a whole nother level. But I highly recommend, if you have an interest in getting into commercial real estate, check out CCIM. This is one of the few designations that is recognized internationally. If you're in Asia and you have a CCIM, everybody knows what that means. It's a big deal to have that designation. So thanks again. Until next time, be well, be kind, and aloha.